The lawyer read the clause aloud in that flat, practiced voice they use when they want you to think what they're saying is routine. All assets, including the property at 14 Birchwood Lane, to be transferred in equal shares upon confirmed incapacity or death. He looked up. My son-in-law was already nodding before the sentence finished. I was 69 years old. I'd spent 32 years as a Crown prosecutor in British Columbia. I knew exactly what that clause meant, and I knew it hadn't come from my daughter. Let me back up. My name is Gerald Sutton. I retired in 2019 after 3 decades of putting people away for fraud, assault, conspiracy, and murder. I sat across interview tables from people who smiled at their victims right up until the moment the cuffs went on. I've watched juries read verdicts while defendants kept perfectly still, having learned by then that any expression could be used against them. I am not a man who misses things, but grief does something to you. My wife Carol died in March of 2022 after 18 months of fighting ovarian cancer, 38 years of marriage. When she went, I didn't eat properly for 4 months. I forgot to renew my car insurance. I walked into rooms and couldn't remember why. That's the version of me my daughter's husband saw when he started paying attention. My daughter's name is Melissa. She's 41 now. She was always the quiet one. Her brother, Patrick, got the loud gene, the easy laugh, the ability to walk into any room and fill it. Melissa was thoughtful, careful, the kind of person who called twice a week just to check in. When Carol got sick, Melissa drove down from Kelowna every other weekend. She slept on the couch. She took notes at the oncologist appointments because she knew I'd forget half of it. I have never questioned her love for me, not once, and I want to be clear about that before I continue. What I questioned was her husband. His name is Troy. She met him in 2018, a year before I retired. And I remember the first time she brought him to the house. He had the kind of smile that arrived just a half-second too late, like he'd decided to smile rather than just done it. He worked in commercial real estate, drove a truck he couldn't quite afford, and had an opinion about everything. Carol thought he was charming. I thought he was performing. But Melissa loved him, and they got married in September of 2019. And I kept my mouth shut because that was the right thing to do. The trouble started about 8 months after Carol died. It was subtle at first, the way things always are when someone is patient about it. Troy started joining Melissa on her weekend visits. That was fine. Then he started asking questions about the house. How many square meters? What I'd paid for it in 2001. Whether I'd had it appraised recently. I told him I had no idea and didn't much care. He'd laugh and say he was just curious, being in the industry, couldn't help himself. Then one Sunday in November, Melissa sat down across from me at the kitchen table with a look I recognized immediately. She'd rehearsed something. "Dad," she said, "Troy and I have been talking. We're worried about you being out here alone. The house is big. It's a lot of upkeep. What would you think about maybe we help you look at some options?" Options. That word. I told her I was fine. She said she knew I was fine. She just wanted to be prepared. I said there was nothing to prepare for. She pushed her hair behind her ear and said they'd been looking into something called a joint tenancy arrangement, just to make things simpler in the future. For the estate, for probate, it was actually very common. Their friend had done it with his parents, and it had saved the family so much. I said no. She nodded, and that was the end of it, at least on the surface. But I saw Troy's jaw tighten when she came back into the living room. I saw him touch her arm the way people do when they're reminding someone of an agreement. I drove home that night thinking about it. I am a man who spent 32 years watching people underestimate how much other people notice. I called an old colleague of mine, Lena Park, who'd moved into estate law after 20 years in criminal court. I told her what had happened. I didn't editorialize, just laid out the facts. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Gerald, change your will. Today, if you can." I asked her if she thought I was overreacting. She said, I think you're not reacting fast enough. I had my existing will updated within a week, left the house and everything in it to a trust I established with Lena's help, with instructions that it fund two things after my death: a scholarship at UBC Law in Carol's name, and a donation to a palliative care facility in the Fraser Valley where Carol had spent her last 3 weeks. I told no one. I made Lena the executor. I asked her to keep it completely confidential. Then I waited. I want to explain what waiting feels like when you used to be a prosecutor. It's not passive. You're not sitting there hoping something doesn't happen. You're paying attention. You're documenting. You're thinking about what a reasonable person would need to see in order to believe what you already know. You think about burden of proof. You think about pattern. You think about what makes something go from a suspicion to a fact. Troy's pattern became clearer over the following months. He started having conversations with me about my estate planning needs while Melissa was in another room. He sent me articles about the difficulties of aging alone, titled things like, "When It's Time to Have the Hard Conversation." He started mentioning, casually, that a colleague of his had a client who did property management for seniors. Great guy. Very reasonable. And if I ever wanted someone to look after the Birchwood place while I thought about downsizing. Downsizing. Another word. In April of 2023, something changed. Melissa called me on a Tuesday, which she never did. Her calls were always Sundays. She sounded off. Not upset exactly, just careful the way she sounds when she's thinking hard about what to say. She told me she and Troy had met with a financial planner. They'd reviewed their situation. Things were tighter than expected. The Kelowna housing market had been rough for him. Commissions were down, she said, and I could hear that she believed this, that they were worried about the future, both their future and mine, that it might make sense for the three of us to think about something more integrated. I asked her what that meant. She said Troy thought if the house were transferred to a family trust, with all three of us as beneficiaries, her, me, and Troy, it would be more tax efficient and would protect the asset from probate. She said a lawyer they'd spoken to had already drafted something preliminary. She could bring it by this weekend if I wanted to look at it. I said, of course, bring it by. I'd be happy to look at it. I called Lena that same evening. I also called a former colleague at the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit. His name is Cal Boudreau, and he owes me 2 favors from a 2011 money laundering case I handed him on a platter. I asked him to look quietly at Troy's business dealings. Nothing official, just looking. What Cal found took about 3 weeks and was not surprising, but it was clarifying. Troy's real estate business was in much worse shape than commissions are down. He had a line of credit at $140,000, a second mortgage on their Kelowna property taken out 18 months earlier, and a tax filing from 2022 that showed income less than a third of what Melissa had probably been told. He was not a man managing a rough patch. He was a man running out of room. The weekend came. Melissa brought the documents. Troy came with her and sat at my kitchen table with the expression of a man who had decided the meeting was a formality. The draft was 12 pages. It was not simple. It was structured so that the transfer of the property to the trust would give Troy signing authority over major financial decisions in the event of incapacity. I read it carefully, which made Troy visibly impatient. He kept saying things like, "The main thing is just page 3, and the lawyer can explain the technical parts, and it really is just housekeeping, Gerald." He called me Gerald when he wanted to seem like an equal. He called me Dad when he wanted to seem like family. I said I wanted to think about it. He said the lawyer needed an answer by the end of the month for the filing. I said I was sure they'd understand. He smiled. It was the late smile. I recognized it. I want to be careful about what I say next, because I've turned it over many times and I still find it hard. 2 weeks after that meeting, I was at Melissa's on a Sunday. We had lunch. She seemed distracted, kept checking her phone. Near the end of the afternoon, she said, not looking at me, "Dad, I think you should sign it. I think it would make things easier for everyone." I said, "For everyone? or for Troy. She looked up then. Something crossed her face that I still think about. It wasn't anger. It was something more complicated than that. She said, "He's my husband, Dad. That means his problems are my problems." I drove home very slowly. I called Patrick that night. My son lives in Halifax. He does something in marine engineering that I've never fully understood. He and Troy had met exactly 3 times and disliked each other with the efficient mutual recognition of men who know immediately they have nothing in common. I told Patrick everything. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What do you need me to do?" I told him to come home. Patrick flew in from Halifax the following Friday. I hadn't told Melissa he was coming. We spent the weekend going through everything, the documents, Cal's findings, my notes from every conversation I'd had with Troy over the preceding 16 months, the timeline I'd been keeping in a document on my laptop that I'd titled Household Maintenance, so no one would be curious about it. Patrick's face got very still. He's not an emotional man in the way some people are, doesn't shout or cry easily, but when he gets quiet like that, I know he's working through something. He said, "He's been doing this for over a year." I said yes. He said, "And Mel doesn't know." I said I didn't think she knew the full picture. I thought she knew things were bad financially. I thought she'd been told a version of events that made what Troy was trying to do seem reasonable, even generous. That's the thing about people like Troy. They're not stupid. He hadn't told her, "Let's steal your father's house." He'd told her a story about security and preparation and doing the responsible thing for their family's future. And because she loved him, and because she was scared, she'd started to believe it. I called Lena on Monday. I told her I was ready to move. Here is what the next 3 months looked like. Lena filed a formal complaint with the Law Society of British Columbia regarding the lawyer who had drafted the trust documents, arguing he had a conflict of interest and had failed to advise an elderly client to seek independent legal counsel, which is required under BC notarial standards when one party to a transaction stands to benefit significantly from the other's consent. The Law Society opened an investigation. Meanwhile, Cal connected me with a financial crimes investigator named Richa Sharma at the RCMP's Commercial Crime Unit. I gave her everything, every document Troy had sent me, the timeline, the text messages where he'd followed up, sometimes twice in 1 week, about whether I'd had a chance to think more about the arrangement. The WhatsApp message, sent to Melissa, which she'd accidentally forwarded to me thinking she was forwarding it to her friend, that said, "He keeps stalling. We need to move this before the end of Q2, or we're going to miss the refinancing window." That message was the one that changed the tone of everything. Richa took 6 weeks to build the file. During that time, I continued acting as though nothing had happened. I told Melissa I was still thinking about the trust arrangement. I told Troy I'd been doing some reading and had a few questions. Could we talk after the holidays? He said, of course, no rush, absolutely. The late smile. Always the late smile. In September of 2023, the RCMP executed a search warrant on Troy's business office in Kelowna. I was sitting in my living room in Vancouver watching the morning news when Melissa called. She was crying. She said there were officers at the office. She said she didn't understand. She said, "Dad, what's happening?" I said, "I think you should call a lawyer. A good one, not Troy's." She was silent for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "You knew." I said, "I suspected. For about a year. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. There are things I've regretted about how I handled all of this. That phone call is at the top of the list. She deserved to know earlier. I made a calculation that involving her earlier would have tipped Troy off, that she might have confronted him and destroyed the evidence before anything could be built, and that calculation was probably correct. It was also painful, and I won't pretend otherwise. Troy was charged in November of 2023. The charges were elder financial abuse under the Criminal Code of Canada, fraud over $5,000, and breach of fiduciary duty. He'd done this before. Richa's investigation turned up a prior civil case from 2015 involving an elderly client whose property he'd been involved in. transferring under similar circumstances. That case had been settled quietly. This one wouldn't be. Melissa retained her own counsel immediately. She cooperated fully. Troy's lawyer, and he went through 3 of them, tried to argue that Melissa had been a willing participant, that the arrangement had been discussed openly as a family matter, that no deception had occurred. The Crown's response was the WhatsApp message. "We need to move this before he changes his mind." Those 12 words. The trial lasted 11 days. I testified on the 4th day. It was the strangest experience of my professional life, being on that side of the witness box. The defense tried to make me look like a vindictive old man who'd set a trap. I said what I'd always believed. Documenting someone's behavior is not entrapment. Entrapment is when you induce someone to commit a crime they otherwise wouldn't have committed. I didn't make Troy greedy. I didn't make him lie to his wife. I didn't make him draft a document designed to give him control of my assets. I just made sure there was a record. The defense lawyer asked me if I'd ever simply told Troy that I was uncomfortable, that I didn't trust his intentions. I said, "Would you confide your suspicions to the person you suspect?" She had no answer to that. Troy was convicted on all 3 charges. The sentencing judge, a woman named Justice Okafor, who had the particular stillness of someone who has heard every possible excuse and remains unimpressed, sentenced him to 4 years in a federal institution and ordered full restitution of $328,000, representing the assessed equity value of the property he had attempted to transfer, the legal fees I had incurred, and additional damages for documented elder financial abuse under the criminal code provisions that had been strengthened in 2021. His lawyer asked for house arrest given Troy's lack of prior criminal record. Justice Okafor pointed out that his lack of prior criminal record had been made possible by a civil settlement that had been structured specifically to avoid one. He was taken into custody the same afternoon. I sat outside the courthouse on a bench. It was October by then, that particular Vancouver October where everything is gold and damp, and the air smells like fallen leaves in ocean. My son was beside me. He didn't say anything for a few minutes. Then he said, "You okay?" I said, "I didn't know yet." The harder part came in the months afterward. Melissa and Troy separated in December. The divorce finalized the following summer. She moved back to Vancouver. She didn't stay with me. She rented a place in Kitsilano. But she called every Sunday again, the way she used to, and we had dinner most weeks. It was not easy. There were conversations we had to have that were some of the hardest of my life. Not because we were angry at each other, but because she had loved him, and I had watched it happen, and neither of us could quite undo what that felt like. I told her once, late at night over tea in my kitchen, that I was sorry I hadn't said something to her directly before all of it happened. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I don't know if I would have believed you." I think she was right. I think the only thing that could have convinced her was exactly what happened, watching the whole thing come apart with facts she couldn't argue with. I sold the Birchwood house in the spring of 2024, 38 years in that house. I helped Carol plant the cedar hedge along the back fence. I can still tell you where Patrick had his 8th birthday party and where Melissa fell off her bike and scraped her knee so badly she still has a small scar. But the house had become a symbol of something I didn't want to keep looking at, and I'm old enough to know the difference between sentiment and attachment. I moved to Victoria, bought a smaller place near Beacon Hill Park, 2 bedrooms, good light, a back garden that needs work. The proceeds from the sale went mostly into the trust I'd established. Carol's scholarship at UBC Law had its first recipient that year, a 3rd-year student from Prince George who wanted to practice Indigenous land rights law. She sent me a card that I have on the fridge. Some mornings I walk through the park and feed the geese, which my doctor says is probably not advised and which I do anyway. I'm 69 years old going on 70, and I have earned the right to make minor poor decisions that hurt no one. My son calls from Halifax on Wednesdays. My daughter comes for dinner on Sundays. We have, the 3 of us, settled into something that isn't quite what it was before Carol died. I don't think it can be, but it's honest, and it's ours, and nobody is pretending. I have been asked, since all of this became known through the trial coverage, whether I feel guilty. Whether setting up the documentation, waiting, building the file constituted some kind of betrayal of family trust. My answer is always the same. I spent 32 years in Crown prosecution watching people tell themselves that what they were doing wasn't really wrong, that the circumstances justified it, that they'd had no choice, that the other person had, in some way, brought it on themselves. Troy told himself a story. I imagine it went something like this. Gerald is old, he's alone, he doesn't need all of this, we're family. It's really just making sure the right people end up with what should rightfully go to Melissa anyway. He probably believed parts of it. People usually do. But belief is not exoneration. Intention is not action, and choosing to deceive someone, especially someone grieving, especially someone who trusted you, especially someone whose primary concern was making sure his daughter was taken care of after he was gone, is a choice made in full. I gave him chances. I said no clearly more than once. He kept going. I just kept better notes than he expected. Some things you can only teach by letting people learn them the hard way. I spent 32 years understanding that. The only difference this time is that the person learning the lesson was someone who called me Dad. Victoria in the evening, when the light comes in low over the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and the park is full of people walking dogs, and the air carries salt and wood smoke and something that might be the last of the summer roses. It is, on its best days, exactly enough.